Excellent. Okay, we are now live. Jonathan Winters from Allegis Global Solutions. Thank you very much for joining me. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. John, yourself?
Very good, thanks very much. So we're here today to talk about the role of the MSP in services procurement, and lots of interesting topics to discuss around that. I wonder if just before we get started, would you be able to just give a little bit of an intro to your background and what you're doing now and kind of the journey you've taken to get there?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a procurement guy by background. So various procurement roles across the years: Barclays, HSBC, Lloyd's. I was the EMEA head of non-tech procurement at Bank of America Merrill Lynch, and I was the head of procurement for a European merchant bank called Close Brothers. Then I joined AGS probably about 4 years ago now, and I'm responsible for our professional services procurement product in EMEA, and it's a product that manages on behalf of clients that professional services category of spend.
Cool. So I think just before we get into some of the detail, one of the things that always comes up for me when discussing this in the market is some slight confusion around the term MSP. So firstly, you've got some people's connotations where they're just looking at it in the context of as an IT managed service provider. And then you've got sometimes confusion where people are associating it with the recruitment managed service provider concept, but failing to see the relevance of where that fits in with regards to services procurement. I think there's some other kind of terminology that occasionally comes up, but what's your take on that in terms of just making sure people understand it correctly?
Yeah. So it's a fair call, actually. Depending on your background, it can be a nightmare to figure out what we're actually talking about there. So we're talking about really MSP organizations, which is the temporary recruitment outsourcing organizations, entering into this market of professional services procurement. And the logic behind, them entering into that market is that there is a big overlap. You've got the pure play contingent engagements, which is, I want one contractor for X number of days on X per day. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got absolutely unequivocally services procurement engagements. I've got a strategy house coming in and advising the board on a product launch. But somewhere in the middle, those two meet, and they don't just meet, they overlap. There's a gray area between where you're going to have SOWs with a bunch of T&M. You're going to have staffing firms who've decided that actually they can get around rate cards by being consultancy firms and so on and so forth. So what we're talking about is that space there. We're talking about applying some MSP skill sets and knowledge to the problems faced by professional services procurement, but also doing so by using procurement people to address those problems as well. So the overlap is really things like creating visibility, using a VMS, tracking the data, onboarding people, offboarding people, that sort of thing. But the pure play procurement piece is running RFPs, it's negotiating SOWs, it's executing SOWs, it's checking to see that those SOWs delivered.
Yeah, I mean, within Allegis, how would you normally describe this? Because I've heard terms like workforce solutions providers. People talk about total talent. I mean, I'm always slightly critical of the total talent angle on this side, because I look at it and think, well, you're buying a service from a company, you're not hiring talent. But ultimately, it's all about workforce management. It's all about getting things done.
Yeah, that's it. It's down to its most basic. Is some work needs doing, and somebody's going to need to do it, and how am I going to engage those people? And really, when you're looking at MSP versus SOW, the question you're asking yourself there is, am I buying a solution? Am I paying an organization to deliver a piece of work underpinned by talent doing that work, or am I paying for the inputs? Am I paying for the talent that we've identified to come in, and I'll guide them, direct them, manage them on a day-to-day basis towards probably the same goal? It's the difference between inputs and outputs, or buying a solution and buying talent.
Yeah, and I think what you said there about kind of taking it back to the beginning and looking at what needs to be done brings me on to the next kind of topic, which is all around the value of triage. And I think there's a scale, or there's a journey at various points that triage input can come in there. How do you see that playing out in the market at the moment, and where do you see the core value of that?
I think for most organizations, what they really need out of triage, and there's nuances to where you are in your maturity journey. But what you really need out of triage for most organizations is, how am I going to drive this piece of work to the most optimal route to market? With the exception of certain regulations in certain countries, there's not really a regulatory answer to this. There's not really a, it must be this, it must be that. There's value and impact questions to be asked. So to me, there's probably three common mistakes that triage processes make today.
Right.
That prevent them from really addressing what's the optimal one, what's going to create the most impact for my business. One of those is that you tend to have institutional problems behind it. And what I mean by that is, you might say, look, consultants don't count as headcount, but contractors do. Or you can use contractor headcount for contractors, but you can't use it for consultants. So you're driving people through institutional barriers. You're driving them to a route to market that's not necessarily the best route to market for the piece of work they're trying to get done. That's one. The second is probably that a lot of triage processes are underpinned by decision trees, and that these decision trees can sometimes be a bit easy to gain. You know, there's 10 questions. If you answer, yes to all of them, you're going to be told to go to the MSP. If you answer no to all of them, you're going to be told to go to the SOW route to market. Well, if you're coming to those with a desire to go one route or the other already, it doesn't take long to learn which one, which answers to give to get the output that you're looking for. So they're not really achieving their aim. They're quite easy to work around. And then the third one is, I think, an issue of proactive versus reactive decision making. So I think what happens often is that as an organization, you've made this decision somewhere in the business, CPO level or global category head level, as to how you want to buy from the market. You've got a strategy as to how you want to buy. And but a lot of decision trees I see, instead of saying, this is how we want you to buy, this is how we want you to engage with the market, can you construct your deal in this way? Can you put these terms into the deal? They tend to be quite reactive. They say things like, are you paying the vendor on time materials or for solutions? Is there payment by results? Are you buying the IP of the individual or the IP of the organization? What that's doing is saying to the business, you construct the deal and we'll put it in place. That's the reactive nature of them.
Yeah, and it's, it does come back to this thing of it being, it needs to be the best fit for what needs to be done. And as you said, that shouldn't be driven by a regulatory angle in the sense of trying to make something fit. It shouldn't be driven by, it should be a pragmatic business decision. What is the most effective way to get this piece of work done? If the most effective way to get this piece of work done is using contractors, then the business needs to use contractors in a compliant manner. Rather than saying, well, it's going to be a bit inconvenient to do that because we have to deal with IR35, for example. That's not a reason to do it in a different way necessarily. It's a question of what's the most effective way, with all things considered, to get this done. Yeah.
Start with the best solution to your problem, and then figure out what the contractual structure is to facilitate that. Don't start with, well, here's a contractual structure, and then can you pigeonhole your solution into that?
Yeah, and I think that's definitely a problem that some companies are wrestling with at the moment. But with services procurement in general, because there's often a very, very much a lack of visibility in this area, that's where things can kind of sneak under the radar a little bit, and you can possibly get models being misused. But when it comes back to triage, where that information is being centralized and managed by a workforce solutions provider or an MSP, then it comes full circle. And we can discuss that later as to the ultimate aim of this type of program comes right back to the beginning of the process. Yeah,
that's right. And like the foundation level of this is that visibility. You can't really do a lot of what you want to do in terms of adding value to this, whether that be triage or using data and so on, without having some level of visibility created. How many people sit under those SOWs? How are they being paid? What are they supposed to be doing? If you can get all of that data built, then you can make really valuable impact-based triage assessments, and you can base your optimal route to market upon data and experience rather than what was promised in the RFP or what's the institutional, back to our headcount versus budgets and so on, what's the institutionally easiest route.
Yeah, and it's interesting what the points you're making about decision trees, because it's something it seems to be quite a hot topic. For certain organisations, it's something that people are maybe quite excited about, and they feel like it's going to solve their problems. The technology element of a decision tree, from my point of view, is pretty simple. Okay, you can try and make these things more programmatic, but ultimately it's about consulting on a requirement by requirement basis, or categorizing requirements into different tranches if they're maybe smaller, and going through a streamlined process. But how do you see the balance in that when it's working very effectively? How do you see the balance in that decision tree process between kind of automation and expertise, if you're providing that, for example, from an MSP point of view?
Yeah, I don't think you can fully automate it. The reason I don't think you can fully automate it is that if you fully automate it, you're going to have two outputs, two choices. That is, this is absolutely an MSP engagement, that's a contingent worker, and that's all there is to it. Or this is absolutely a professional services engagement. Speak to the SW team and get an SW put in place. Whereas in actual fact, because of that grey area that I talked about earlier, that overlap, quite often the answer should be, hey, this could be either. There are pros and cons to one or the other. Maybe you're looking to mitigate risk, maybe you're looking to keep costs down, whatever. You now need to speak to somebody who spends their whole life in that world of the grey area between MSP and SW, and they're going to help you understand what's the best fit to your piece of work. You can't automate that piece out so easily, because that's a conversation, that's an education process for the user, helping them understand what each route to market would look like, and so on. I think what you can do is you can filter out 80% of the engagements through automation to make that job a quicker and more effective one. But you still need some elements of people behind that.
Yeah, and within the automation, do you see opportunity in the kind of the gathering of requirements and the understanding of common requirements? I mean, if you look at a services procurement program, typically, what percentage of the overall spend would you see as fitting into the types of requirement that can be categorized as very similar or similar enough to be put into groups? Because the whole point with complex services is they're complex, which is why they're not easy to manage. They're not easy for companies to get on top of. It's a difficult, it's a challenging technical solution to be provided. When you look at these types of programs, how are they generally structured? Because from my point of view, sometimes we look at this type of thing and it seems like there's no commonalities and everything's completely different. But what do you kind of tend to see across the board?
Yeah, I think very rarely do you have no commonalities. Actually, this is roughly, unresearched answer, roughly the breakdown. So you're going to find that about a third to half of all SWs in most large organizations' books are going to be IT-based SWs. They're going to be building integrations, acting as an SI, running small IT projects. You're going to find a small little percentage at the very top of truly unique. And even the unique tends to be unique to industry rather than unique to business. So there's going to be something that the pharma world does that banking doesn't, and something that banking does that construction doesn't. But you're going to find most of it's going to be IT. Then you're going to have some change. You're going to have some ops. Almost identical vendor lists certainly for everything of scale. It's going to be the same vendor list. So actually, there's a huge amount of commonality across the marketplace on the face of it, in terms of what are you doing and who you're using to do it with. Where you lose the commonality is in how are you engaging them to do that work, and how are you paying them to do that work, and then how well are they delivering that work. So you might have one organization operating two identical clients doing an identical project and come up with wholly different results because of something that the nature of that business, the nature of that location, the nature of that team. But that's all hidden. So the commonality disappears after that first couple of layers.
Yeah, so obviously you can have commonalities within industries, and you'll get certain commonalities across the market. Within organizations, obviously there are going to be key departments, like, for example, you mentioned the level of prevalence of this type of spend in IT, for example. And I guess it's always a measure of maturity and how far along an organization are with managing this type of spend, how big they are, the size of their spend, etc. But one of the things that, even if you look at contingent workforce, generally managers find it quite difficult to write job descriptions. Companies are always working on the latest, with their MSP, the latest version of all their updated job descriptions. And, that's fairly easy to pigeonhole when you compare that to project-based SOW. So there must be, some real challenges for organizations. Well, I know there are challenges for organizations just in terms of writing good requirements. And I would kind of see that as part of the triage process, potentially, if you describe it as triage, a bit further down the line, obviously. But I always think there are opportunities within organizations where they can learn from best practice, where requirements are being written that have some commonalities that, for example, maybe in the future, certain elements of that could be templated, which could pull in various kind of standard bits of information to make life easier for people. But at the moment, it's within most organizations, it's extremely ad hoc. What's your view on that from the point of view of commonalities and opportunities to streamline that within an organization?
Yeah, I think the opportunity is there. So if we think back a few years, it was all the rage of procurement to start cataloging a lot of your commoditized goods. Punch out catalogs make it super easy for somebody to go and buy. And that sort of shied away from the more ambiguous sorts of products and services, such as professional services. But I don't think it needs to. I think there's a core of most projects that overlap. So it's an IT change project. There's going to be a change manager or a project manager. There's going to be some developers. There's going to be whatever. You can build the core of that, and what you're adjusting is the peripheral of it. So you're adjusting how long is it going to take, how many systems are they working on, and so on and so forth. So I think you can start to catalog the core of that, and then allow flexibility to adjust bits and pieces of it. And if you were really to spend a lot of time going through what you've already bought in the past, you'll find that there's a lot of it is just buying the same stuff or very similar stuff over and over again. In which case you should be able to catalog it quite easily and start almost pre-negotiating that with vendors. Hey, look, this is the sort of thing I'm going to come to market for 3 or 4 times a year. I want to be really quick when I come to market. How much it's going to cost? How long is it going to take? And then people can order it much more quickly.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you're saying about the kind of how it can in some ways be formalized and categorized more effectively. I mean, if that's where I see the divergence between the use of technology for goods and materials versus services procurement, because obviously, as you said, goods and materials very catalog driven. It's quite binary. It either is this or it isn't this. Whereas with services, it's just so much more complex. There are obviously those shades of grey, and I think there are certain elements of how a statement of work should be written within a particular organization that can be captured and used to inform the process and help people make use of that channel or use that channel more effectively or control the use of that channel more effectively. But I think there's also potentially some real expertise input that can be given to just help people write better requirements. And I think that comes down to, within the organization, it comes down to potentially opportunities for the MSP to really help with that. But I also feel that the supplier can potentially be a very valuable part of that. How do you see that stacking up in the sense that, for example, if it's a really specific piece of work where the supplier owns the expertise?
Yeah, I'll come on to the supplier in a second if I can, but just to wrap up one bit you mentioned there around sort of creating the control and that expertise of helping build those SOWs. I think that actually the biggest thing that's driven by should be the maturity of the organization. So if you're an organization, and we're talking here, I guess, like the buying maturity of the organization. If you're an organization with quite low levels of maturity, you're probably not got a lot of control of the process. You've probably not got a lot of people following the process if there is a process there. And what you really need there to move yourself along is more rigid ways of doing things. You want it standardizing in a system. You want to have template contracts. You almost want the business unit not to get too involved in the contract, just to come to you and say, well, this is what I want doing, and then you're going to use your expertise to build that for them. As you progress down that maturity journey into something a little bit more advanced, I think you should be giving some of that power back to the business unit in the form of empowerment rather than lack of control. And therefore, you should be looking at ways of working, processes, policies, tools that facilitate the business users building a lot of their own deals, but with the information, with the tool sets available to them and the education to build really great deals.
Yeah, and we certainly see that from a tech point of view, in the sense that the self-service element of technology to manage services procurement is absolutely critical. just the ability for users within the business to be able to do that. And
that self-service would be potentially dangerous in a completely in an environment where it's not suited to it, where there's nobody's got a clue what they're buying, how they're buying it, whether they should be buying it or not. But in the right environment for an organization who's probably been acting in this centralized way for a few years, and people learned the value of procurement, learned the importance of sticking to the rules, potentially in a regulated environment, so there's a bit more of a culture of that. That self-service is really empowering the business users there, and also what it's also doing is getting you more buy-in. And I suspect you guys probably see this in terms of uptake. Most procurement organizations probably at best get about 70% of total spend flowing through themselves, the spend that should have flowed through them. And even that would be considered quite decent. And I think there's 3 reasons why people don't engage procurement. I know better. I don't want to spend any time on it, or I've got something to hide. And if you're able to empower people to approach the market themselves, build deals themselves, see the data that helps them make better buying decisions themselves, assuming it's right for the culture of your organization, you take off the table that I know better and I haven't got time for it arguments, and therefore you should get more spend throughput.
Yeah, definitely. And what we tend to see is that the level of control that you may want to layer on, for example, through a tool like ours, depends on the maturity of the organization. It also depends on the culture of the organization. Some organizations would just, it's just people aren't told what to do. They just, they're independent and they get on and do it. That doesn't mean that, having self-service access, for example, through a system that's guided by input, for example, from an MSP, that is no reason why that can't still lay out a useful path for them. So, for example, allowing self-service, but having that as effectively a guided process where you might have templates and you might have certain fields that are configured in certain ways that aid that process, I think can be really useful. And then procurement can layer on as much or as little control as they may want, because the most important thing, as you rightly said, is getting that uptake initially. Without the data and the process flowing right through, then you really don't get the insights and the value at the end of it. But I think also there's one of the points you brought up there is quite an interesting one, just with regards to for example, templating the contractual process, or at least having a structure around that. And I kind of see this part of it as 2 bits. I see it as the requirement, and then there's the work order or the statement of work. So one of the things that I think some organizations or some stakeholders find quite difficult is actually just communicating that requirement out to the market. And there's a skill to doing that. And there's also a skill to then formulating the scope of work and the work order. And I think some companies are quite wary of getting suppliers too involved in that, because it might feel like the tail wagging the dog, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy and all this sort of thing. But equally, if there is a sensible process with back and forth there, I think not the writing the initial requirement, but when it comes to shaping the work order, that can be a really collaborative process. But I guess from an MSP service point of view, there are opportunities to add value and get involved when it comes to actually just, guiding people through requirements. I mean, we sometimes see situations where even a requirement will go through a sign-off process before it even goes anywhere else, and it will be refined. And I think there's maybe quite a bit of value that can be added at that point, but then also at kind of maybe refereeing or helping with the scope of work decision point.
Yeah. What the MSP will often do, or the service procurement provider will often do in that early stage, is help the business user, first of all, just really start to articulate their requirements and start to think about what they want to get done rather than what they think needs to get done. So what's the goal? I need this integration building by Christmas. Often, even if that's the aim, the first engagement will involve somebody coming to the team and saying, "Hey, look, I need 4 people for 6 months." Okay, well, what are you trying to achieve? What does good look like? How do we articulate that? That's the first task. Because once you've got that down, you've got a fighting chance of finding somebody in the market who's going to commit to delivering those results. There's absolutely value in the vendor base getting involved in that, because if you alone set the outcome criteria, you're potentially going to miss some innovative solutions. I think I need an integration, but actually somebody else in the market might be able to tell me a different way of solving the problem. So there is value in engaging with the market there, but the biggest value just comes with sitting with somebody who's approaching the market on a day-to-day basis and saying, okay, these are the ways we're going to describe what you want to get done. This is how we're going to use the contract to ensure that various sort of quality levels are achieved. This is how we can link the risk to the contract, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of what the team will be spending a lot of their time doing, and also just ensuring that one of the highest points of value in this whole process is tracking what happened after the SOW was executed. But you really need to be the stuff you're doing beforehand is what's going to set you up for success in tracking that. So well constructed, relatively standardized, but still detailed statements of work, clearly articulated requirements, acceptance criteria, payment terms, milestones, and so on and so forth. That's what's going to set you up for building great data at the back end. So one of the things that program teams will often do is spend a lot of time with the user in the business, really getting that down to the perfect level of detail.
Yeah, and we do tend to see kind of user hierarchies within, if someone's using the system with an MSP involvement, there'll be a split user hierarchy of different roles and different areas of levels of handoff, where a requirement over a certain value might automatically go to the CFO for sign off, for example.
Yeah.
It might be that all requirements go through some sort of initial MSP requirements triage process just to check they're up to certain standards, and then that can help feed into things like templates and stuff like that. So it's a process that builds with the maturity of the program, really.
Yeah, and that's something that's really useful. And it might be value, it might be risk factors, it might be they're going to have access to client data, so it needs extra sign-offs or what have you. But it's really useful, because what happens if you don't have those extra levels of visibility is that you think you've put templates in place, and you've used a system that insists that they fill in the deliverables and the acceptance criteria, but you end up with meaningless deliverables or acceptance criteria. All the time we see statements of work where the deliverables is, you'll send me the following resources, and the acceptance criteria is that we sign off their timesheets. So what the organization has done in those situations, they think they've put controls in place, but they haven't put checkpoints in place to validate that those controls are working, and therefore the controls just haven't worked. So yeah, those extra levels of approval with deliverables and scopes ensures that you're actually getting what you think you're going to be getting from running a program like this.
Yeah, and I think it's a tellingly pragmatic exercise to have to go through this, because it comes right back to, what is the business looking to achieve? How well is the business communicating that? And how well do individual stakeholders and business unit managers understand how what they're doing is contributing to the overall strategy of the business? So I think it's absolutely critical. And as I say, it's a very pragmatic thought process. Goes back to what we were saying about how the requirements created in the first place, it being the best way to get the piece of work done, and defining that work and understanding the objectives. The kind of the growth we're seeing in the use of statement of work, or the increased appreciation of this model and the increased scrutiny on this model for various reasons, cost pressures, things like COVID shining a light on spend like this, then also regulatory factors and the general transition. That is certainly the case, that there are trends around work moving more to outcome-based delivery necessarily than just time materials. It's very easy to say, I want a Java developer working X many hours a day, and they'll just get on with it, and things will get done when they get done. Whereas actually defining an outcome is just so much more pragmatic. But in some cases, it's a bit of a leap for some organizations or some stakeholders to get their heads around. Yeah,
and it's a little bit more work on the front end. Building those acceptance criteria and deliverables, and building the milestones and creating mechanisms to track those milestones and release payment on those milestones. But in the long term, it makes a world of difference. I mean, how many contractors get extended on their term? How many times have budgets have been sort of added to in order to facilitate an overrunning project? Whereas if you'd just transferred the risk in the first place, it would have taken you a bit more time in the beginning, but those later problems would have gone away.
Yeah, exactly. No, I totally agree. So one of the things we were talking about was just getting the supplier involved in that whole kind of requirements and sort of work order creation process. And you mentioned with stakeholders within the business, when it comes to self-service, the three issues being, if I remember them rightly, I know better, I haven't got time, or I've maybe got something to hide, and therefore I'm going to try and circumvent this process. One of the things that I want to come on to discuss is the value of having some level of vendor centricity to make this work on both sides. Do you think that some of the issues and obviously if you make the process awkward for a supplier to do business with an organization, they're going to want to go around it. But do you think that maybe there are those similar kind of things to address on that side as well?
Yeah, I think certainly if you don't build it with the supplier in mind, it won't work, because the supplier, without exception, will have stronger relationships throughout your business, certainly at senior levels, than most procurement teams will have. And therefore, if you build a process that they don't like or don't want to engage with, they'll just work around you. So you've got to build something that works for both the user, the person in the business who's going to request some work getting done, and the vendor. And if you can do those, then you've got a program that will work. And in order to build a vendor-centric solution, you need to find, well, what's in it for them? What's the upside? It might be that if you follow this process, you know, you can be certain that you'll be getting paid on time, which, you know, in some organizations means a lot. It might be that if you follow this process, you're going to get visibility to the opportunities that you didn't get to see before. You know, you've been doing great work in Department A all these years, but you've never met anybody from Department B. If you follow this process, it'll allow Department B to see what you're up to. Or it could be any number of things, but you've got to find something that's in it for them. Otherwise, the vendor will be tempted to work around the process. And then as soon as you've done that, you've lost any benefit of running a centralized program.
Yeah, and obviously it's going to vary depending on the size and type of organization. And you've got different problems within different parts of the supply chain that need to be addressed to make this work for them. For example, you might have smaller suppliers that are super innovative, you know, and they fit in really well with the organization's policies around sustainability and diversity and whatever it might be. But it's hard for them to get noticed because the organization has concrete relationships with some very big suppliers that they tend to use across all areas, just because there's very low risk in the individual decision makers around doing that.
Yeah, and this goes back to something I said earlier, which is that most of the value is in figuring out what happened after the SOW was signed. If you can really track, and I tend to boil it down to 4 key questions. Did the vendor do what they were supposed to do? Was it done to the standard that was agreed? Was it done in the time frame that was agreed? And did it ultimately cost what they said it was going to cost? Well, if you can track all of those, you create a level playing field. You know, these small vendors with innovative solutions and so on, they might have virtually no marketing and sales budget, but they might be amazing at delivering work within your business. Whereas for larger organizations, they could still be good, but they've got the marketing ability to silence the smaller players. If you can track those data points and start building a data set on those and allow that to start influencing decision making, you've leveled that playing field. You've given a voice to those smaller suppliers where it's earned, and you've also maintained the voice of the larger suppliers where it's earned. And you're able to say to the suppliers, hey, look, if you're doing great work for me, the whole business is going to know about it. That's going to win you more business. That's going to facilitate your growth. We're going to reduce your cost of sale. We're going to really sort of shout it out when you're doing good stuff. That should get a lot more buy-in from all scales of suppliers.
Yeah, and you know, when you're looking at this information and you're looking at visibility and you're trying to create a valid decision-making process, you can't do it if you're only capturing part of the information. So to benefit the big suppliers, you need to capture all information. To benefit the small suppliers, you need to capture all information. And if everyone's operating on a kind of equal footing in terms of the fact that they are providing a service to the business and they are a trusted partner of the business, it makes sense to understand really effectively on both sides what's going well and what's not going well. And it will create opportunities, as you say, visibility within the wider business, but also just in terms of finding out where things are going wrong. Like the fact that, you know, if you're using a system effectively, you can get real-time reporting. That's something that's very interesting to a lot of people because, you know, find out that a project is going wrong before it's too late in terms of how that flows up the reporting chain. Because as you were talking about earlier, in terms of creating value on the client business user side and also within the supplier side, procurement can sit in the middle. And they just get the value of just having all this visibility and all of this data. So actually, they might be kind of orchestrating things, but not getting in the way effectively. Might be the wrong phrase, but just, you know, really allowing the process to flow, but then being able to draw out insights and notice problems when they're coming up and address that. Yeah. Because typically, I would imagine that's something that's very much after the fact. something's gone wrong with this project. Can you go and have a look into why the suppliers hasn't delivered? You know, what's gone on? And then you're into looking at trying to find the original contract, looking at the original milestones, what's changed, what's been tracked. And if that's not centralized anywhere, that must be a hell of a task.
Yeah, and procurement tends to, and I'm sure there are exceptions, but procurement tends to operate as a bit of the sort of SOW conveyor belt. You know, they get engaged at the beginning of the process, they put the SOW in place, it gets negotiated, approved, executed, and then they go and do the next one. They don't tend to get the opportunity to be involved in what happened after the SOW is signed, unless something goes dramatically wrong, like you say. So I think having that data helps on the micro level of, hey, this deal's not going very well. We've got some early warning signs. Can you know, come and help? But I think it also helps on the macro level, where you can start to build up this data set that says, well, these are the vendors that within my organization deliver on time, on budget, to standard. How many attempts do they take before they get things right, and so on. And then instead of just sort of looking to resolve the deals that have gone wrong, you can get ahead of that and stop appointing the companies who don't deliver very well, stop appointing the companies who get involved in those deals where you then got to step in later, and start driving work towards organizations who've got a solid empirical track record of delivering good quality work on time, on budget, within your specific environment. And if you've got a good enough data set, that can be down to location, to a particular facility, it could be down to skill sets, it could be down to scale of projects, and so on and so forth. But once you build a big data set, you can cut that data in so many ways to facilitate these more insightful and empirical decisions.
Yeah, and there's so much valuable information to be unearthed. You know, I always tend to quote the value of the of services procurement spend as being, you know, trillion plus, but I saw a really interesting recent report from you guys that, you know, put the value of it, you know, significantly higher than that when you take all of these facets into account. So it certainly makes sense that the opportunity to really put scrutiny on this area and understand the value and understand what people are getting for their money is an incredible opportunity. It's a massive opportunity.
Yeah, and you're sort of faced with two choices then. You know, are you gonna go back to your business and say, well, you know, here are some ways we can add more value to this spend category. Here's ways we create more visibility. That visibility can translate into value, and this is what it means to the business. Or are you going to react when the business comes to you and says, actually, you know, it turns out that we feel this is an area of spend that needs more scrutiny. I was talking a couple of years ago now to a CPO, pretty large company, and they were spending about £500 million a year on professional services. And like most companies, you know, they knew who they were spending it with, how much each vendor got, start date and end date of the programs, maybe some project titles, the sort of thing that you would have in your P2P. But that was about it. Didn't really know an awful lot more granular level detail than that on what that half a billion was going to. And the CEO, understandably, at one point in a cost-cutting environment that business was in at the time, came along to the CPO and said, well, you know, what did we get for £500 million? And he couldn't really say much more than, well, this is who we spent it with, this is how many deals they did, this is how much each one earned from us. And the CEO instantly, as happens in a lot of organizations, put some controls in place. Like, all consultancy spend that comes through me, I've got to approve it regardless of value. What that CPO really wanted to be able to do with his boss was to say, yeah, this is how much we spent, and this is the impact it's had on our business. This is why that 500 was really well spent. This is how we drove it to vendors who deliver good work. Here's all the work they delivered. Here's all the milestones that were delivered. Here's what we're expecting to happen in the next 30 days, 90 days, so on and so forth. And really show that money was being managed to value an ROI rather than managed to process and transaction.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, you know, it comes on to this whole element, which we can discuss later, around, you know, managing to budget versus managing to value. But again, this is complex. You know, most projects are different. There will be some commonalities, but projects are different. It's not like buying goods. It's not like just hiring people on a time and materials basis. It's a very specific type of requirement to manage as a whole. Which kind of brings me on to one of the points I wanted to make, was just in terms of, as an MSP, or as a workforce solutions provider, where you're addressing this within organizations versus where organizations are just doing it on their own. What's the difference? Is it just that the ones that are looking to do it on their own just have that effective capacity? Because, to be honest, I don't really ever see procurement teams that aren't lean. Very, very rare to see that. What's the difference, and what are the hurdles that exist for those organizations that are going to look to do it on their own versus the opportunities and the benefits where they say, actually, we're going to outsource this problem in some way?
Well, I guess if it was simply a capacity play, it would be a relatively short-lived business, because that would very quickly commoditize. And yes, you're right, all procurement teams are lean because all procurement teams are seen as a cost reduction department. Therefore, it's very difficult to go back to the boss and sort of say, I'd like to hire an extra 10 people. You can't incur cost, you should be there to reduce it. But it has to be about more than just, we'll augment the team. So it has to be about bringing insight and skills. It has to be about addressing something that they weren't already addressing themselves. And to most organizations, that is for what happened after you signed the SOW. That's the bit that's really not something that most businesses were doing themselves. Now, there's a lot you can do before the SOW is signed in terms of running those RFPs, articulating those deliverables and so on. And the better you get at that, the easier it is to manage the what happened afterwards. The easier it is to track that. But for us, it's about both sides of that event, that signature event. Can we build really, really good quality contracts and transfer risk and run market competitions and so on up until the point of execution? And then really importantly, can we follow that SOW, every single SOW without exception, through to conclusion, and then learn from that and ensure that data loops back to the beginning of the process and drives better buying decisions next time around. And I guess in theory, any organization could do that themselves if they really wanted to, but it's about bringing the technology, it's about bringing the experience, it's about having done this in however many other organizations that allows that to be done in a scalable, efficient, and manageable way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the best practice side of it must be a huge element, and it's just that specific expertise that's not necessarily going to exist within, or it's very rare for it to exist in most organizations, certainly that we come across.
And when we talk about in this world, we often talk about the overlap of professional services and contingents. It's that gray area, and as much of that gray area exists in the deliverable, and that being the contracts that are being provided or service providers being provided, it also, that gray area is a fairly niche world to staff fixing the problem, right? So finding people who've got an understanding not only of procurement and buying services and transfer of risk and negotiating contracts, but also the talent world, because ultimately these SOWs are backed by talent, and you've got to identify that and you've got to manage that as well. Finding people with that overlap is difficult, and it is an area where the MSPs perhaps have an advantage over the in-house teams trying to build that out themselves, especially as ultimately an in-house team will be an SOW program within a client will either be owned by procurement or HR. And if it's owned by procurement, it'll be very procurement centric in the way it's being managed and the way it's being staffed. And if it's owned by HR, it'll be very HR centric. Very rarely do you find ones where the two have sort of managed to collaborate really well and build teams with cross skill sets.
Yeah, so obviously from your point of view, your background is absolutely pure procurement prior to this, but I guess within the setting that you're operating within, you have now the opportunity to really kind of cross-pollinate from all of the best practice that already exists within that MSP world in the contingent workforce space, where although the two delivery models are very different, it's still about getting work done. And as you say, there's still kind of somebody doing something at the end of it by the very nature of it being a service that's delivered. So yeah, as you say, there are grey areas, but in terms of offering a service to help a client manage this, it needs to be quite a holistic viewpoint. And so for an organization to be able to outsource it, they can outsource it to get this holistic solution. Whereas if they want to try and set that up internally, as with anything, if you want to try and insource it, you can always try and build it all out, but it's never going to have the level of efficiency that you can have if you've already done that for 20 customers and you're bringing in the solution where you've seen all these things work and come across various problems. Absolutely. Not to say there won't be the requirement for some serious problem-solving skills where everyone does everything differently.
Yeah.
Even if they've got the same systems and similar industry, there seems to be a lot of variation.
Yeah. Everybody's got their own little uniqueness, and it helps once you've built a client that spans multiple industries, various skill sets, and so on and so forth. But everybody's got their own little uniqueness, and that's why you've got to hire talented people. people who can think themselves, people who can come up with solutions. But fundamentally, you've got to keep it to the core objective, which is helping an organization manage risk through their SOWs, guarantee that the service is going to be delivered to the organization, make better buying decisions, figure out what route to market makes the most sense for you. That's all, that's the product. The people who sit around that need to be, bright, motivated individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that you mentioned was that the core gap is effectively what happened after. What happened after this was agreed, what happened in the delivery. And we totally see that from a tech point of view, in the sense that that's the gap. You can create a purchase order in a P2P system perfectly well. There are lots of systems out there. We can do contract processes. But as soon as you get into capturing the information and then making sure it's delivered in a way that's consistent with that and measuring that delivery, that's where the real value sits, and that's where the real gap is. When you look at the tech landscape out there, so from our point of view, we're approaching this from a very specialist angle. But there are various kind of different approaches or different kind of ways that the market could look at this. What's your view on the kind of the role of tech within this services procurement setting, within an offering such as the offering that you guys provide, and also the role of dedicated tech versus kind of generalist or existing technology?
Yeah, I think the dedicated tech piece is a really simple question. You need dedicated tech. You alluded to it earlier. It's a unique category of indirect procurement. This is one of the few categories where you're buying something that you can't measure, you can't weigh it, you can't test its speed or so on, like you could with hardware or software or any of the core categories. It's ambiguous. It's difficult to manage. So the core traditional P2P platforms just kind of don't serve it particularly well. So you do need dedicated tech. You need tech that is addressing the unique problems of the procurement process. These are, something that can run an RFP, something that can help you build a contract, and so on and so forth, but comes from a background of understanding the treatment of individuals and so on. So, it's no good just building a pure play output contract if you've got no way to onboard the resources. You've got no way to track how many people you've got, where they are. Are they in a safe part of the world? Are they in a dangerous part of the world? Did they come to work today? Didn't they come to work today? You've got to have that sort of the coming together of technology. So it does need to be dedicated because it's a unique set of problems. So it's a unique piece of software. It needs to have all its obvious integrations, because a lot of organizations will have a policy that all contracts must end up over here, or all spend must flow through this particular area. That's fine. You can adjust all the integrations to make that happen. But dedicated tech's an essential, and tech that's grown out of this emerging market of SOW and MSP operating side by side. And then to the other point in there around what happened afterwards, it's not as straightforward as it sounds to track every SOW through to conclusion. And because we're all different, and they'll have a different number of milestones, and they might be in different places and with different actions associated with them around payment or remediation and so on. So that's quite complicated stuff. And then the bigger complexity is turning that into the data to make the better buying decisions. You or I, I'm guessing, would never buy something off Amazon now without reading some reviews and did it, you ordered it, did it turn up on time? Was it damaged or not when it arrived? Were you fairly happy with the product? Yet people don't traditionally do that yet when they're spending millions and millions on professional services at a corporate level. So I think there's this space that the technology needs to fill of building not quite an Amazon 5-star review process necessarily, but something quantitative and qualitative around, hey, have these deals delivered as you'd expect? Were they, was it easy to work with this organization or not? Did they meet the standards that you expected to or not? And then the tech platform can build all of that out and then facilitate that high level of efficiency on the next purchase.
Yeah, exactly. And it ties into the 4 criteria you mentioned earlier of, did they do what was supposed to be done? Was it to the appropriate standard? Did it happen in a timely manner? And did it happen to the appropriate cost? And there are various kind of quantitative metrics that should be captured within a specialist services procurement management system that will inform that part of the process. But then there's the other side of it of, did they do a good job? And in terms of measuring quality, that could be to specific criteria. It could be to things like, it could even take into account things like the innovation delivered or the sustainability of that particular supplier or the way that that work was delivered. It doesn't really matter, but that qualitative element plus the quantitative element is something that could be really used to make powerful insights, but it only works if the workflows can capture that information. And I think this is where you get this big disconnect at the moment, where typically you might have a process that can capture a statement of work agreement, but it'll end up sitting in a shared file. It doesn't, you're not, the management of milestones, for example, just won't be programmatic, and it won't be dealt with at a granular level. And that's where I think the complexity of buying services versus buying goods, again, is a really relevant point, because unless you capture that granularity specifically relating to how services are delivered, there's no way you can make those insights and inferences later, because it's not just as black and white as buying 50 red widgets.
And this is why tech's so essential, because let's assume an average mid-size sort of FTSE 250 organization is going to execute somewhere between 500 and 1,000 SOWs a year. And if every SOW has 4 milestones in it, and you want to ask those 4 questions of each of those 4 milestones, you start getting to a scale where efficiency, ease of use, an ability to aggregate data and so on is an absolute must. I've seen organizations try and sort of deal with this with, we'll use our P2P and at the side we'll have some sort of spreadsheets of vendor management and so on and so forth. It doesn't work when you get to that sort of scale. So if you really want to be able to track those qualitative and quantitative outputs and then use those for decision making and ensure that you really understand what you bought and whether it was delivered and whether it was any good, then you do need dedicated tech. But at the same time, it doesn't need to be sort of super complex, super high end, revolutionary stuff. It's fundamentally a relatively straightforward challenge you're setting. It's workflows, it's data capture, and it's data interrogation. But it needs to be, I guess, developed out of a team who understand that space.
Yeah, the devil's absolutely in the detail, and there's also the aspects of what happens in real life versus the theoretical panacea of what looks great. Real life comes along, things change, people need flexibility, different organizations take a slightly different approach to others. So I think the core workflows are always going to be fundamentally the same, that if that's correct for this type of engagement model, it works. However, it's all of the stuff around the edges of that. You need to have the ability to be able to configure and work with how an organization needs to work, and quite often be informed by the workforce solutions provider or MSP that is assisting or working as part of that organization. It's still fairly early in the market in terms of maturity from that point of view, in terms of the number of tech solutions in this area. And I think sometimes companies can get caught a little bit between in a bit of a space between traditional contingent workforce technology and top level procurement technology, where effectively the milestones can just kind of fall through the cracks, fall through the gaps in the sofa. But when you were saying earlier, this is one of the most difficult categories, or the only category that you can't measure. It's so complex and so diverse, but as you said, there are always those fundamentals. Was it on time? Was it to budget? What was the quality like? How much scope creep was there? How often does this supplier, what's their average cost overrun? How often do they win a bid? How often are they on time at a milestone level? Once you start collecting this information, even if you're collecting it in what I would call a fairly passive manner, where you're not putting loads of restrictions and onerous governance on top of people, you're just getting them using the system, making it nice and easy on both sides. You're just collecting this information and this flow through.
Yeah, and it doesn't become the only thing that you base your future decisions on. It just becomes an extra data point. So you're still going to run the RFPs, and you're still going to hear the promises from the vendors as to what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, how long it'll take them, how much it's going to cost them. But you're looking at that next to some data of, okay, well, they've told me something similar a dozen times before, and they've always met it, or they haven't always met it. You're also able to challenge some preconceptions. Almost every procurement person will have a similar story, but every organization, you've got somebody in the business who's always uses the same vendor for the certain piece of work. They always have that vendor, and unless you've got the data, you kind of can't challenge that. You can't say to them, hey, look, let's try and use somebody else, because the answer will be, but I know my stuff, and I know it's the only firm who can do this. Once you've got enough data about that firm's done it in this other department, they've done it fine, and the one you're using has had these issues. Once you've built data, you can maybe validate their view. Then the data maybe proves that they were right to always use this vendor, but it maybe introduces them to an opportunity to do something differently. But you can only do that with data, because fundamentally, as a procurement person in an organization, you're the expert on procurement. You're not the expert on what's going on in each individual department. Years and years and years ago, I did some procurement in the NHS, and one of the contracts I did was for a deal to buy heart stents, little thing that goes into a vein going out the heart, from what I can remember. There was no way in the world I could add sort of, subject matter knowledge to that contract. In fact, it'd be crazy if it was to try. We needed the specialist doctor who knew his stuff in there. And what we needed to do was bring his knowledge of heart stents to my knowledge of procurement and use that to approach the market. So you're not looking to the business to try and sort of trip them up with this data and to force them into certain deal structures because you suddenly know better. You're just using it as an extra data point to maybe validate what they already know, or maybe introduce them to other options they wouldn't necessarily have seen unless the data was there to help them.
Yeah, and ultimately the role of technology in that is as an enabler to this overall goal, which I guess you could say is capturing the process. You need an effective process to capture that data, but then taking that data and taking it right back to the beginning, kind of where we started, about what needs to be done and what's the most effective way to do it. And that comes on to kind of one of the last key points that I really wanted to cover, which was around the role of the MSP or workforce solutions provider within the services procurement market, in relation specifically to visibility and the relationship between that visibility and ROI. And we're kind of touching on it here, but ultimately it's about the value versus cost saving discussion as well. And I'll be interested to get your views on that in terms of how you see that playing out in the market, and also just the recognition of that value rather than just the cost saving element. Yeah.
So I've been in procurement now since early 2000s. And in all of that time, there's been a continuous conversation in procurement about wanting to move away from being measured on cost savings. Cost savings are an easy enough measure to have because they are what they are. You get to the end of the year, have you hit that number or haven't you hit that number? It is kind of easy to measure, but it's not really what matters to the business. Yes, the business might need to manage costs down, but actually what they mean by that is we need to manage value, right? And procurement hasn't traditionally been measured on value, it's been measured on cost. So that narrative in the industry has been going on for a very long time. I think that programs where you are measuring what happened after the contract was executed, where you're putting more effort into finding the right route to market, where you're putting more effort into articulating deliverables and acceptance criteria, they could facilitate that move towards value as opposed to cost. Now, I think that the target state is still a true ROI, a true sort of get to the end of each project and get an ROI number. That's a little way off, but the first steps towards ROI are understanding, what happened. Did the project succeed or fail? I mean, all those 4 points we talked about before are really a proxy for that question. Did it work or didn't it work? Did I channel spend towards a vendor who maximized my chances of that working? And then at the end of the year, how many of these projects that I managed delivered great results? How many didn't? And then the ones that didn't, what did I do to sort of course correct after that and find a way to address that number in future? That allows you to start entering into a value conversation with your business and gathering all this data around what was supposed to happen, how much did it cost, how long did it take, and so on. That allows you to get into a conversation about how procurement facilitated launching a new product, procurement facilitated entering a new market, procurement facilitated building a new system, as opposed to, procurement managed 500 million and we managed to reduce it by 7 million this year. You don't know whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. So getting into value conversations is far more important.
Yeah, the not knowing whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, I totally agree with that, because ultimately you might have the typical situation of a CFO saying, we spent 100 million on services last year, we need to cut that to 90 million this year. Well, if it was delivering a really good return for you, then you're cutting off your nose to spite your face. But getting to that point requires not the credibility, but it requires procurement to be being seen as providing strategic input, as you say, rather than just saying control cost. Because and if procurement are armed with this information, and they are able to oversee a process without, as I say, not getting in the way of the process operating nice and smoothly, where appropriate, then it just allows something that is going to be ultimately of real value to the business to come to the fore, where procurement can advise the business and they can get to that front end of the process and start looking at who are our most effective suppliers, what other business drivers are there that I need to take into account. Okay, we've got a huge drive on making sure that all of our supply chain have great records when it comes to sustainability, for example. That's an important criteria. We then need to factor that into all this other information that we've got, so that we can add value to the supply chain that we're engaging from the supply chain that we're engaging with.
And until you have those systems and processes in place that allow you that granular level of detail, then the CFO can only come and say, spend 10 million less next year. This is the only option. Once you have tools in place, policies in place, processes in place, teams in place that are able to drill it down to individual actions that happened underneath each and every SOW and quality outcomes and satisfaction ratings and individual clause items within contracts, then there's options for other strategies to happen. But really, any other strategy couldn't be executed unless you have that in place.
Yeah, I mean, do you think there are still some organisations out there that would, would swear blind that as long as you're working to budget, that's fine? Because I've certainly come across some organisations where that seems to be the thought process internally. Whether that would be voiced up to the C-suite or whether that would be voiced out to the market might be different. But there seems to be within certain organisations seems to be a level of satisfaction saying, well, as long as I'm working to budget, that's fine. Do you think that, firstly, is that acceptable in this kind of like post-COVID world where there are all these, if you're spending X amount of money, which, organisations are spending huge amounts of money in this area, is that really acceptable? Surely not.
No, I think a few things on that one, actually. So as you sort of suggested, I think that breaks in the hierarchy somewhere. I'm operating to budget, so it's fine. I think if you ask the CEO that, they might disagree. Somewhere in the hierarchy, that message would switch. So, but then again, there might still be exceptions to that. I don't know, but on the whole, I think that would be the case. Fundamentally, if you're, when we talked at the beginning of the process, you're doing this triage, you're figuring out, what am I trying to achieve? What's the best route to market to make that happen? Even if you've got the budget, if you can't articulate what you're trying to achieve, I think we fundamentally have to ask, should you be spending any money anyway, right? It's what are you aiming to do? What is it this money's supposed to deliver? And therefore, if you can't measure whether that happened or not, then are you really a sort of acting as a strong custodian of those budgets? And then also, I'd say that I'm operating a budget is fine, is probably an okay argument when budgets are relatively easy to come by and times are good and the economy is growing. When you hit the other part of the cycle where budgets become a lot harder to get hold of, boss had like 500 grand and I promised to operate within that 500 grand isn't going to cut it. You're going to need to be able to say, this is exactly what I expect to do. This is how I'm going to ensure that this happens. This is how I'm going to make sure that I've got as much change left at the end of the process as possible. I think that we're operating a budget argument is one half of the cycle, but not both.
Yeah, and I think when you're looking at this sort of process being implemented, it should be helping the stakeholder. Like you say, if the stakeholder doesn't really know what they want to buy, and maybe in that scenario, they're not acting as the best custodian of that budget within that organization. Maybe if they had a bit of help, it would be good for them and it would actually work. Maybe they want to be a better custodian of that budget, but it's difficult, really getting to the point of defining milestones and it might be a wider problem within the organization where they need to flow that problem up a little bit to understand actually what is it you want me to do. So I think always it comes back to this thing where I just look at it as it's a very pragmatic work delivery model. I'll pay you X to deliver Y. Did Y get delivered? If it did, excellent, here's your money. And it's just that pragmatism can flow right through the whole scenario, and I think can add a lot of value in all sorts of areas.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's an element of when you hear it put this way, when you hear it like that, I'm going to pay you this money to get this work done, and once you've proven that it is, I'll pay you. Very few people will argue against the logic, and almost everybody will agree that's the best way to operate. However, we've been operating for decades of just I'm going to hire in a lot of T&M based people, and I'm going to guide them towards the answer, and I'm going to hope that we get there, and I'm going to hope we get there before my budget runs out, and I'm going to hope we get there before my end of the year review, because we're trying to deliver against my objectives. I think when people understand that you can transfer risk, and then that you can manage that risk transfer after execution, and that you can make informed buying decisions, and you can manage that risk even further down by seeing who's been successful in the past. I think most buyers, most people in the business unit looking to engage for a service, will pretty quickly come around to the idea of engaging in that way.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's horses for courses, isn't it? As we discussed with the whole triage process, there's certain things that are going to be best to use time materials, certain things that are going to be best to use permanent employees, certain things that are best to be delivered on an outcome. But if you have the option lined up, ready to go, and working effectively, then you can make maximum use of that channel where it's most appropriate. Couple of last things before we wrap up. So in terms of cost savings, another element that I thought would be interesting to get your take on is just how hard do companies try and squeeze? And when you've got just a cost-saving mentality, rather than trying to drive this value, which I think the value can be measured to a certain, or to a large extent, around, was it delivered? Was it on time, on budget? How much, was it within scope? And did they do a good job? That's a pretty good measure of value to start you off with. In terms of return on investment as a specific metric, that's obviously slightly more complex. As you said, that's probably the holy grail. But with a cost-saving mentality, there is this squeeze, and which can be very effective in some ways, but where does it cross that line?
Yeah. People react to measures. So whatever you're incentivized on as an individual, that's probably where you're going to put your focus, right? So within the organizations where you see the most squeezing, and it can sometimes be, it's going to hit a wall at some point. There's a cost of sale, there's a cost of delivery. So you can only reduce your vendor's costs so much before you simply can't engage them anymore. But the organizations where you see the most of that are the ones who can only measure against cost savings. And therefore, it's the only thing you can give people as their objectives, and therefore it's the only thing they'll do. There's a cycle there. The organizations who can measure value will measure value and will incentivize people towards it, creating value. Because frankly, it's just a better business approach. But until you've facilitated the ability to do that, it's not something you can switch to. So I guess to the core question, it still happens a lot. There's still a lot of organizations who are really focused on savings. It's an awkward category to be in if you're focused on savings, because it's a lot of new projects, and therefore you don't always get an official saving. The way it tends to work is, how much did we spend last year? How much did you spend this year? Well, the new projects, you didn't spend anything last year, so you've got no cost saving. So it's a kind of an awkward category to be in if you're stuck in that pure play saving space. You're probably going to drive towards a lot of T&M because of rate cards, so you can create savings measures. If you can move your business into value, you'll free yourself up to have a more interesting role and be able to articulate a lot more of the impact that you're having, as opposed to just, manage to squeeze 10% further out this year, but that's going to end at some point.
Yeah, so the procurement can articulate in more easily the value that they're providing, but also they're delivering more value. In essence, they're able to deliver more value. They can move away from just transacting and take a more strategic approach to it, where they can inform future buying decisions and inform kind of retrospective measurement of what's been done, and that is massively valuable. Last question before I let you go. Last kind of area I wanted to just quickly look at was, obviously your core expertise is very focused on that procurement side. But if you look at the use of MSP programs in the contingent workforce area, in terms of the level of maturity of the entire kind of ecosystem of expertise, process, technology, and the kind of all-round service offering, if you look at that within the kind of traditional contingent workforce MSP scenario versus this services procurement scenario with the appropriate offering that can be used for that, how far would you say, how far behind is the services procurement element of it compared to the contingent workforce element of it? Because I would see the contingent workforce element as being fairly mature on all these angles. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, the contingent programs have been around a lot longer than the services program, so they had a longer period of time to mature and, I guess, almost standardize. The advantage that gives to the services side of things is that there's still multiple different approaches across the marketplace to how you would address services. Now, my biased view is that you address that by taking the best of the MSP world, you know, the management of tools, the creation of visibility, the onboarding, the offboarding, the knowledge of talent, and you merge that with procurement people who have been running RFPs, negotiating contracts, and so on for many years, and then that brings you the right mix. But the I guess the what should services look like question is not a settled question right now. It's still early in its place in the market, so it's not as mature, but it's maturing at quite a rate. You know, if you sort of roll back 5 years or so, it would have been relatively forward-thinking and considered innovative for procurement teams to be going out there and engaging a third party, especially an MSP, to manage their SOWs. Today, it's pretty much the standard. Almost, yeah, so certainly the vast majority of the RFPs that we see for MSP, certainly in EMEA in the US, have an element of SOW to them. It might be a small element, it might be bigger than the MSP on occasions, but it's become the market norm. So it's maturing at a greater pace, driven by demand, driven by the market conditions, driven by this need to switch to value as opposed to cost. But yeah, it's certainly not been around as long, and therefore there's aspects of it which are still open to debate.
Yeah, it makes it a really exciting space to be in. I would wholeheartedly agree with you on that, and I think that certainly echoes the sort of feedback that we get from the market. But yeah, I think it's going to be interesting times ahead, and with stuff like COVID kind of almost accelerating the process with just that emphasis on what am I spending and what did I get for that money. I think it's a good time for companies to be addressing this.
And I think, you know, you mentioned COVID there. There's COVID, there's IR35, there's unique to industry issues. But what this all is, they're all just flavors of reasons why people should have known better what was in their SOWs, and therefore it's prompting people to get greater levels of visibility on all the SOWs they execute from here on in. COVID, you know, as organizations put hiring freezes in place as COVID hit, they weren't able to very quickly sort of course correct how they were doing their SOWs because they didn't have the visibility of what was in them. As IR35s sort of come along, people put great IR35 programs in place around their contingent work populations, but haven't been able to do that because they didn't know where the contingent sat within their SOW portfolios. And then, you know, this theme recurs around the world under different regulatory regimes and so on and so forth. But all of it just simply says, hey, look, even outside of that transactional day-to-day, I want to do the next deal better, there's strong reasons why you really need to know what's inside each and every SOW, how well it's going, how it's structured, where the risk sits, where the resources sit, and so on. And I think they all just come together. It's not one incident, it's all of these incidents come together to prompt people to start looking at managing their SOWs differently. Yeah,
I totally agree. And there comes a time where the push forces overcome the fact that this is a tricky problem for companies to solve, which then prompts the development and maturation of effective services with the expertise, the process, the effective technology to deliver this and make it possible. As I say, I think it's going to be a really exciting next few years in terms of watching the journey, this what I expect to be a rapidly accelerating journey along the maturity chain. And as you say, things like IR35, things like COVID, IR35, as you say, that's basically going to have equivalents all around the world. Then you've got other factors that throw in there, like Brexit, where it changes the dynamic between how companies can access talent. But anyway, listen, really, really interesting to talk to you. Thank you so much for all your insights. It was really great to get your opinion.
Thanks very much, Johnny. Enjoyed it. Cheers.
Superb. I hope you speak to you soon.
See you soon. Bye. Bye.
Cheers.